Well, thanks for turning out. I'm taking a real chance when I put the curriculum together for the forum on the Trinity. I thought, I'll put Hegel in. Then I thought, oh God, I can't put Hegel in. And then I thought, well, I can't not put Hegel in, because in terms of the contemporary theological and actually philosophical historical landscape, he's just an enormous influence, and especially when it comes to the doctrine of the Trinity. Like Hegel basically single-handedly resuscitates the dying carcass of the doctrine of the Trinity from the 19th century, where it was just going to be swept into the dustbin of history, and really makes it a much more central theological category, even though, and Tim is already alert to the places in the reading I handed out where there are some problems, even though Hegel is viewed as a bit heterodox, if not even heretical, right? So some people would say Hegel's heterodox, which origin is heterodox, right? Heterodox simply means orthodoxy is always expanding, which it is actually. And some of the best ideas the church has came sometimes from the heretics, and we didn't credit them, and sometimes mostly from what people who were called heterodox. They're creative thinkers, like Eckhart would be a great example. Thomas Aquinas is another one. Origen of Alexandria is another one. They're creative thinkers who push the boundaries and try something that hasn't been done before, and they can often be very controversial, and Hegel is definitely one of them. So I'll point out the places where I think the issues are. But on the other hand, I mean, he's just way too interesting to pass by. So I hope I can do him justice this morning. We're jumping 1,400 years from last Sunday, which is, a nice historical leap. But I thought if we don't, we won't get to contemporary Trinitarian theology. And so I wanted to be able to do that. And in order to set the table for that, I'm sorry, the screen is in the way. In order to set the table for that, I think Hegel is really important. And the last time we talked about Augustine's really a rather amazing interpretation of the Trinity as in terms of the model of love, a community. So God is a community of love for Augustine. God is the Father, who he calls the lover, and God is the Son, the beloved. And then there's mutual love there's communion of love between the Father and the Son. That's the Spirit. And so, as he says in the reading from last time, when the Spirit pours love for God into your heart, the Trinity is entering into your life, right? Because all the work of the Trinity is one. So where the Spirit is, there the Father and the Son are also. But I think that's a really nice model from 416 of the Common Era to get around a problem we have, which is this Father-Son language, the baptismal formula leaves us with. So to say lover and beloved and love is actually a very different way of thinking about it than Father, Son, and Spirit. And Augustine, we have to salute him for giving us that model. And it comes right out of the Bible. This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. And the Spirit comes upon him when he's baptized. So for Augustine, the baptism of Jesus reveals the lover, the beloved, and love. So Hegel actually then, 1,400 years later, Hegel will take this model that God is love and try to think it through philosophically, right? Which is really interesting. So he's a philosopher, although some people would say he's not really a philosopher. He thinks historically, but I think he actually is a philosopher. But he's doing so in an era of the Enlightenment and also the French and the American revolutions, which are very important to keep in mind. So when you see the word freedom in the reading, that's freedom after the French Revolution kind of freedom, right? I mean, the idea of freedom anyway is very important. He gave a series of lectures, I'll talk more about him, but he gave a series of lectures on the philosophy of world history, which became very influential a few years ago during the Arab Spring, in which he said the meaning of history is freedom, right? So Hegel insists that history is working toward freedom. And the French Revolution and the American Revolution would be the first sign that that's happening. And you may have heard there was a philosopher named Fukuyama who was writing at the time when all the empires were falling. The Soviet Union fell, apartheid fell in South Africa and stuff. And he wrote a book called The End of History. That's Hegel. who's basically saying freedom has been attained globally now. History is at an end. Well, as we know, nice try. This is always the problem with philosophies of history, including Christian philosophies of history, like apocalypticism. The end is coming tomorrow. Oh, I meant a week from now. No, actually next year. No, anyway. So, but that shows you just how influential Hegel is even today. That somebody would write a book during the Arab Spring talking about the end of history. Now we're actually talking about the resuscitation of authoritarianism, which is really kind of a scary thing. The other thing to keep in mind about him is that he's working in the philosophical time of Descartes and afterwards. And so Descartes, the theologians like to say when philosophers were by and large dead, when they're talking about Aristotle, who lived a long time ago, they say philosophers are the handmaidens of theology. Well, once philosophy starts to get its footing again in the 17th century, they don't want to be anyone's handmaiden. In fact, they view theology as an inferior, actually delusory enterprise from which they're trying to free humanity. So they either use reason to correct the excesses of the churches, or they use it to substitute the truth of reason for whatever revelation churches claim. And they had an interesting point, which was, after the Reformation, there was just endless warfare in Europe, culminating in the 30 Years' War. And it looked like religious people excelled at just hating and destroying each other. We still see this phenomenon today, so we're not out of the woods on that one either. And so they thought, well, we have to turn to another criterion to free ourselves from this kind of conflict. And that criterion would be universal human reason. And so if you just clarify the ideas of reason, and quit consenting to ideas that are just founded in passion and imagination, then you'll free yourselves from conflict, strife, superstition, etc. And so Descartes, as you know, reduces everything down to the cogito. I think, therefore I am. That's the first clear and distinct idea you have. And the second clear and distinct idea you have is that you couldn't think, you couldn't doubt if you didn't have an idea of perfection. And so the idea of perfection is there's a perfect thing. And that would be God, right? And that's a clear and distinct idea of reason. But you shouldn't assent to anything that's not clear and distinct, which means what happens to the Trinity? Because say what you will about the doctrine of the Trinity, on Cartesian grounds or any other, it is hardly clear and distinct, right? So even though he never said, oh, and I reject the doctrine of the Trinity, he was Roman Catholic, he's never going to say something like that. The influence of his thought was, if you believe in the existence of God, the reason can demonstrate, well, you don't even believe it, reason can demonstrate the existence of God, but that God is one, right? That God is a perfect thing and perfection is one. And so the Trinity is absurd or irrelevant, right? It's absurd for the Cartesians. It's irrelevant for Immanuel Kant. There's this great, because for Kant, reason gives us our duties. We don't get our duties from God. Reason gives the law to itself. And so he says in the conflict of the faculties, whether there are 3 persons in the deity or 10, it makes absolutely no difference for the moral law to which I'm bound. Right, so even if there is a Trinity or a 10, whatever that would be, it doesn't matter because it has absolutely no bearing on my own conduct. It has no bearing on my own conscience. So this is the era in which Hegel is being raised, and it provokes a reaction which we're still living with, and you'll hear it in churches all the time, and that is this reaction against the intellect. Right? Well, faith isn't intellectual. Faith isn't something of the understanding. That's the philosophers. That's irrelevant. That's cold. That's toxic. That kills religious life. Religion is feeling. Religion is experience. Right? And so this is a solution that's going on right at the time of Hegel. Friedrich Schleiermacher picks this up, and he picks up on things that Jonathan Edwards saw earlier. Religion is based in the religious emotions. It's not based in ideas. It's based in the emotions, and the primary emotion for Edwards would be love. And so you get the pietists played off against the philosophers, right? So at the same time, you have Isaac Newton and John Locke. Sorry, it's just what I kept getting Lessing, where Locke is, and John Locke. You also have John Wesley, and Charles Wesley, and some of the most beautiful hymns that have been written in the English language were being written at the same time. So people think the Enlightenment, oh, cold, rational, awful, but it's the same era as the Wesleys and Zinzendorf. Zinzendorf's traveling through Pennsylvania, founding Lidditz just north of here, the Moravian movement, et cetera, very much based in this emotional field as well. Well, Hegel was raised in, I was talking to Tim about this before we began, the German Lutheran pietist tradition is incredibly fertile, right? Incredibly fertile. It gave rise to Goethe. It gave rise to Immanuel Kant. It gave rise to Hegel. It gave rise to Schelling. It gave rise to Hölderlin. It had to be Søren Kierkegaard, Danish Lutheran pietism. Okay, so so Hegel himself is raised in a Lutheran pietist home. So he's raised on religion is about feeling. It's not about the intellect. But he himself had a rather formidable intellect. And so he set about in his life trying to overcome this dichotomy between reason and feeling, between reason and religion, right? He thought this was a false antithesis. And so he thought you just have to think, we're just accepting an unreconciled situation without thinking it through. And so his thought was to think through Augustine's idea that God is love by means of the Trinity. And Hegel became convinced, he was a deeply religious person in his own way, he became convinced that the doctrine of the Trinity is absolute truth, but revealed in a symbolic way, right? So the Trinity, not the unity of God, the Trinity of God is the key to everything. Everything in the universe will manifest the Trinity. This, of course, was Augustine's dream, right? That he was looking around for vestiges of the Trinity all over the place. And in his work on the Trinity, he's trying to find them as many as he could. In the Augustinian tradition, they even go further than that. If you read Bonaventure, a scholastic theologian, he's looking for Trinitarian paradigms all over the place. Oh, thank you. These reminders are really annoying because they just updated the system and now they're saying it needs updating. Anyway, so for Hegel to say this is a really cross against the grain, if you will. He's going very much against the grain. But what he's going to do is claim that the truth is apprehended in different ways, right? So at the very beginning of the Christian movement, truth is apprehended by faith. And faith is feeling at that point. They just feel, and it's more than feeling like feelings, Anyway, it's not that kind of feeling. It's an apprehension. It's an intuition of reality. And by the way, there's a lot of interesting work being done on intuitions now. They're real. Don't go against them. If your intuition says, I can't trust this person, go with it. Don't try to explain it away. Seriously. Or my partner's being unfaithful to me. I have this intuition every day. Don't ignore it, right? So he's right, actually, that our primary way of apprehending truth, the first way of apprehending it, is this kind of faith, this apprehension, almost pre-conscious. And then that leads to narratives, right? Which we get the New Testament combined with the Old Testament. And that then leads to doctrine, because you want to explicate the truth of what you're feeling. You're not just going to be satisfied with saying, I feel it's true, and I don't care what the content of that is. This is Hegel anyway. On the other hand, you could, right? You could actually be a person who's never going to move beyond the feeling of the truth of the faith, and that's fine for him. Actually, there's no problem with that. It's just that you can then be a sitting duck for critics like Reimers and others who are going to tell you what, and now, God, go into Barnes and Noble, there are tons of books telling you what about a lot of BS Christianity is, right? Yeah. From the ground up. So if you just want to go with feelings, then you're going to be prey to people telling you, no, they made the resurrection up, this whole thing about the Trinity's poppycock, all that stuff. So Hegel, the church knew they couldn't just do that, right? So they had to set forth the content of the faith doctrinally. But they do it in picture-like language, right? Symbolic language, imaginative language, Father, Son, and Spirit. It sounds like a family, right? And a patriarchal family. This is what feminism is pointing out today. So, but for Hegel, there's truth being said there as well, but it's not being said philosophically. It's not, and therefore it's not being said so that you can show the necessity of what's being taught there, right? And so for him, what you have to do, and to his credit, he points out the church did this over and over again through its history. They tried to turn the doctrine into concept, right? So they tried to turn it into a concept that you could then demonstrate. And demonstrate means 2 + 2 = 4, that kind of demonstration. So there's a necessity behind the doctrine. And so Hegel actually thought that what needed to happen was the church isn't thinking through the Trinity anymore. It's true. In his age, they were all embarrassed by it. So it's kind of like paying no attention to that doctrine behind the curtain, right? And the philosophers are just slamming it as being like irrelevant or stupid and leading to all sorts of other superstition. And then if you're also interested in other religious traditions like Judaism or Islam, then it's a real problem because it's offensive to other people. But Hegel thought what you have to do actually, instead of ignoring it, is think it all the way through. Especially think through the axial moment in the Apostles' and the Nicene Creed, which would be what? Death. God passes through death. And we ignored that in the tradition over and over and over and over again, which is why we read Tertullian way back in the day. Because Tertullian said, he was arguing against the Patripassians who said the Father became human. That means the Father suffered and died. And for Tertullian, no, the Father can't suffer and die. It was the Son who suffered and died. And no, it wasn't the Son who suffered and died. It was his human nature that suffered and died. Because God is immutable. God is one. God is unchangeable. God can't die. And Hegel thought, that's the problem. The confession says, and he was crucified under Pontius Pilate. Who's the he? The one who is God from God, light from light, true God from true God. Right? So what happened? Oh, no, we didn't mean that. We meant the human nature died, and the divine immutable nature was untouched, etc. So for him, this is the key. The key is the Trinity through death, right? So that's why I put a quote in Headline Happenings, if you saw it, that he said, the reconciliation in Christ cannot be understood except in a triune way. Because if God really passes through death, then the Spirit is absolutely necessary, because that's how life is maintained through death. I mean, it's a brilliant insight. Whether or not you agree with him, it's an absolutely brilliant insight. And it changed, if you've heard of these other works, like Moltmann wrote a book called The Crucified God. It was very influential. That comes right out of Hegel. I mean, he quotes Hegel at the beginning of it. So anyway, that's going to be the key. So hopefully we'll get to that point in the reading. So he in order to develop this idea, and he calls it the idea, the absolute eternal idea. The absolute eternal idea is the Trinity, right? But now conceptualized. So Hegel's concept for the absolute idea he calls spirit, Geist. And his first major work was called The Phenomenology of Spirit. He wrote that, I think, in 1809. It was right. He was finishing it right when Napoleon was marching into Jena. It's kind of this very famous moment. And he thought that the idea of world spirit was marching into Germany. That tells you something about his politics, I guess. But anyway, so he calls what we call God, he calls the eternal absolute idea, right? And so he thought that this idea, far from being ahistorical, far from being self-identical, far from being unchanging, far from being impervious to death, this idea is history, right? The idea that God is history. The history of the world is the history of God, right? It's a really astonishing claim. And that then raises history to a level it never had before. So history is rational, right? History is reason itself. And so if you understand the Trinity as the idea, then you understand everything. And so he writes, he gives lectures. He stops writing books. It's kind of interesting. He writes The Philosophy of Right, but everything else we have from him after Phenomenology of Spirit are lectures. Sort of lectures on the philosophy of religion, lectures on the history of art, lectures on world history, lectures on the history of philosophy. Why? Because history reveals what's absolutely true. History is the self-revelation of what's absolutely true. which is why the book was written, The End of History, because now we have freedom, and that's, in world history terms, that's the meaning of history. So you'll see in the reading as we go along that the history narrated in the New Testament, the history narrated in creeds, is the history that God is. I think that's an amazing statement, actually. So God isn't this ahistorical being who just acts in history from the outside. God is history. God is historical. Pardon me?
Part of his oneness.
Yeah, exactly. So how then does God maintain oneness?
Big round.
Right, exactly. How does God maintain unity if God is also historical? So the very first quote on the page gets to this. These are from the lectures on the philosophy of religion, which he gave several times. This is from the 1827 lectures, which I think are the best version of that. All we have of these are student notes. So thank God these students were really good stenographers and they gave us his lectures. So he says the absolute eternal idea is, and you'll recognize in this the creed, right? The absolute eternal idea is one, first in and for itself, God in his eternity before the creation of the world and outside of the world. And we'll look at that. That's the doctrine that in historical terms is called the immanent Trinity. So God's relationship to God's self apart from the world. So that's the first moment. Second, God creates the world. Nothing's and posits separation. He creates both nature and finite spirit. Now, pay attention to that word spirit, because spirit is what God is. Okay, what is created is at first an other, posited outside of God. But God is essentially the reconciling to himself of what is alien, what is particular, what is posited in separation from God. He must restore to freedom and to his truth what is alien, what is fallen away from the idea's self-diremption. So finitude is actually infinite spirit distinguishing itself from itself, separating itself from itself, but it's still itself. But now it's itself in separation from itself. This is the path and process of reconciliation. So reconciliation is a huge category for Hegel. Anytime you find an opposition, it must be reconciled, right? Slave and master is an opposition that has to be reconciled. Martin Luther King was a doctoral student at Boston University before he became the Martin Luther King we know. And he was asked once, and I'm still trying to track down where I saw this, but I know he said it. He was asked once, what was the most important course you took as a doctoral student at Boston University? And he said, I took a year-long seminar on Hegel's philosophy of logic. Why was that the most important thing? Because wherever Martin Luther King saw an opposition, he sought reconciliation. Boy, do we need that voice today. That's seriously. Now all we get is fuel the opposition, right? Palestine versus Israel. We just love that crap. So can you imagine Hegel being a major influence on Martin Luther King? But think about it. He just kept looking for these polarities. Black, white was obviously one, but at the end of his life is rich and poor, and it was global. The rich and poor of the globe need to get together. We need to overcome that dichotomy. So anyway, reconciliation is Hegel's watchword. And then in the third place, through the process of reconciliation, spirit has reconciled with itself what it distinguished from itself in its act of diremption. Don't you love these words? Diremption simply means dividing from itself. Dividing itself from itself, of primal division. And thus it is the Holy Spirit, the spirit present in its community. So for Hegel, what the end of the process is, you start out with God and God's universality, you pass through God and God's particularity, and then you end up with God and God's concreteness, and that's community, right? That's community. To put it another way, you start with the universal, you go through the radically individual, and you wind up with community, right? Which is the spirit. So the goal for him isn't Christ. The goal for him is spirit and community. It's really interesting. The other way he tries to work this, and he thought for a long time of doing this as the main idea. The idea is love, not the idea is spirit. And you can see this in the second quote. He says, specifically, the eternal idea is expressed in terms of the Holy Trinity. Can you imagine saying that on the other end of the Enlightenment? It is God himself, essentially triune. Notice it's essentially triune, not 1 in 3. God is essentially triune. God isn't really one. God is essentially triune. When we say God is love, we are saying something very great and true. But it would be senseless to grasp the saying in a simple-minded way as a simple definition without analyzing what love is. For love is a distinguishing of two who nevertheless are not absolutely distinguished for each other. The consciousness or feeling of the identity of the two to be outside of myself and in the other. So it's not like I'm not a narcissist, right? I'm not in love with myself. I'm relating to myself in the other. This is love, right? And another way he puts this is love is being at home in the other. I actually think that's beautiful. I confess that's the way I feel about my wife in particular, right? I'm at home in her. I'm not at home, and that means I can't be at home in myself anymore, which is, very distressing when you think of the alternatives, right? So you have to learn how to deal with that as well. Yeah, I know, exactly. So he says, this is love, and without knowing that love is both a distinguishing and the sublation of the distinction, one speaks emptily of it. In other words, she's not just a repeat of me, she's other than me, and yet we're one. She is at one with me, I'm at one with her. We even start to laugh the same way. It's kind of scary. But anyway, mirror cells, they start developing that way. So that's basically the rhythm, right? So God posits God's self as an other out of love, and then is in that other, and then is therefore at unity with God's self. So that's going to be the rhythm as we go along. So there are 3 moments in this history that God is, that he talks about. God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit, right? And obviously they're all 3 present all the way through, but he's just going with the creed. I think it's so interesting. He's writing these lectures on the philosophy of religion using this Trinitarian framework. And so he says, when we say God, we speak of God merely as abstract. Or if we say God the Father, we speak of God as universal, only abstractly in accordance with God's infinitude. God's infinitude means precisely that he sublates this form of abstract universality and immediacy, and in this way, distinction is positive, but he is precisely the sublating of the distinction. Okay, so what he's saying there is, even apart from the positing of the world, the creation of the world, God posits God's self in another, which would be what we'd call the Son, and then returns to God's self as the Spirit. So God is this movement. God is this process, to use language process theology we'll pick up on. God is this process of positing the other and then returning to God's self in the and through the other, right? And but there is no genuine finitude. There's no genuine other at this point, because it's all within the realm of infinitude. So the Son is an other, but the Son is also infinite. And the Spirit is an other, and yet the Spirit is also infinite. But even without the creation of the world, God distinguishes God from God's self and then returns to God's self in reconciliation. So, but he calls this a free play of love. So there's nothing really serious about it yet, because there's no death, actually, right? But God's life is this kind of free play. Yeah, no.
I just read a quote the other day, just kind of describing saying it was a knock and the door will be open to you.
Mm-hmm.
And the disciple comes to the door, knocks it, and he says, "Who's there?" He says, "It's I." He says, "There's no room."
Mm-hmm.
He goes away, comes back, knocks on the door, and he says, "Who's there?" The door is open.
Mm-hmm.
So it's
That would be Hegel. That would be Hegel. Absolutely. So, so he would say even, and another way of thinking about this is, if God is conscious, how do we attain consciousness of ourselves? We attain self-consciousness, right? So we have to actually get outside of ourselves to know ourselves. So we even do this. We posit a self, if you will, outside of ourselves by which we know ourselves. And so God does that. So when Schleiermacher talked about immediate self-consciousness, Hegel said there's no such thing. That's an empty set. I think he's wrong, but that's a story for another day. But his point is that everything we know through another, right? So when you knock on the door, who is it? If you say it is I, then you're positing yourself, right, as absolute. And that for Hegel, that's a great story. That's very Hegel, actually. So it's that would be the overcoming of that self-diremption. I love these words. Sublation is another one. You can take these home with you. So.
There's spaciousness too that you feel in prayer when you get an idea of a lot of space, freedom.
Yes, freedom. Yeah, that would be right. And that would be,
goes right along with
that's
that
right.
idea.
That's right. And so for him, again, we have to remember he's doing this philosophically, but he's not saying everyone has to do this, right? So, but he's trying to tell people who are experiencing this freedom in prayer, they're not crazy. That's actually absolute truth manifesting itself in your life, even if you never put it that way. So no, that's a really good point. But there has to be another step, and this is a very controversial move that modern theologians make. Some of them say follow Hegel on this, and the others, when we get to Karl Barth, he won't. But Hegel would say God would not be love if God did not posit God's self radically other than God's self. So if God simply were this immanent trinity, this play of love, then God really wouldn't be love at the end of the day. He says that. Jürgen Moltmann quotes that and agrees with it. Karl Barth quotes that and disagrees with it. So one of the major questions would be, is this play of love in the immanent trinity love, or is it really an inadequate form of love? Hegel would say it's inadequate. And I can see his point, because there's no other. What is the other of the infinite life that God is? The death of an individual. Right? So God has to pass through, God has to posit God's self, if you will, in another genuinely finite reality that then is genuinely shown to be finite by death. Right? So this is going to be the problem. And then pass through that and be reconciled to God as spirit. So he says in that second to the last quote, that this is the step of the Son, if you will, is when God enters into this finitude, the determinacy of finitude, as he calls it. And right in the middle of that paragraph, it says, the act of differentiation is only a movement, a play of love with itself, which does not arrive at the seriousness of other being, of separation or rupture. So spirit enters into a rupture. Yes? Oh, Glenn?
It wasn't that important, but so is Hegel basically saying the Trinity is just a relationship within itself? It is not a relationship that is connected in any way to the other.
Oh, no, it's essentially, yes. So the Trinity is the one posits itself as the other and then is reconciled to as the one. So going to Mel's illustration, which is beautiful, the Trinity is God recognizing God's self in the other, who's radically other, but recognizing the unity there and reconciling that otherness to God. So it's a movement, and that's the most you can say. It's this movement, right? It's a history, and actually, it's a history that's narrated in the Bible, right, and in the church. So that's what's going on in world history also. So does that make sense? And it's this is the problem that he's going to get into with why he's heterodox at best, is that we are God. Right? We are God in God's moment of finitude. And when we come to know God, that's God coming to know God. Right? So we'll think about it, though. He says that Paul defines faith as spirit bearing witness to spirit. Right? Well, then we're spirit. And the spirit is bearing witness to itself in a way in us. That's why we recognize it as true. And so I mean, he's very interesting this way. But yeah, this is the sum and substance of his thought is that when we become conscious of God, God is becoming conscious of God as finite, right? And therefore, the antithesis between finite and infinite is overcome. Timmy, you go ahead.
Well, I think you just answered my question, but I'll ask it anyway. As I heard you talk about the unity, the separation, and then back into the unity within the Trinity of God. To me, it was explaining then the unity of God with all creation, that God is everything, and that we are God. In saying we are God, it isn't elevating us to some sort of great power.
Right,
It
right.
is showing
That
that
relationship.
that relationship, that the Trinity shows us then the unity that we have with God.
Mhm.
Is that-
No, absolutely. Yeah. And he's going, you can just hear this passage in his theology, philosophy, which is God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself and giving to us a ministry of reconciliation. Well, he views his philosophy as that part of that ministry of reconciliation, right? So the Achilles heel of his philosophy on another side is nature. So for him, God is thinking spirit. And so God becomes finite as thinking spirit, but the nature itself, unthinking nature, is not part of this movement. And Schelling, his friend and colleague and later opponent, that's what he goes after. His nature has to be spirit, right? And so you could actually adapt Hegel to say what you said, which is finite reality. And in fact, what is more finite than a rock? A dead human being is more like a rock, right? So if God is this process of positing God's self as finitude and then returning through finitude to God's self, why not the universe be the positing infinitude? So that is one way. He doesn't do that, but that's one way of trying to expand him using his friend Schelling to do it. But it's a really good point. But you can see already, I mean, the movement here is really quite spacious and generous. Yeah, Gay?
I don't know how to posit this is a question, but to me it comes down to the idea of the immensity of God.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that all the time God is, and God is in motion, and God does, and God thinks, and God lives, and God breathes, and we do too, that all of this is going on. And I think what happens when we try and itemize it, which I think is important, is we can lose sight of the big picture. So in a sense, no matter whether it's Hegel or anyone else, this will break down as long as we focus on this one thing, however immense it sounds to us as human beings. So I see, yes, the other, but God exists, simply just is. And if God doesn't, why are we having a discussion?
No, that would be, yes, of course. Yeah.
And he even be here is the other good question to ask ourselves.
Right. No, and for him, yeah, that would be, I mean, he would clearly think the existence of God is very, very important to demonstrate, but not really a tough call. For him, the existence of God is really self-evident, but the question is, what kind of existence is God? And so I will turn us, so we don't run out of time, to then this positing of finitude, and especially human beings. And that is, as Timmy brought out, that is a point where he's not as generous, if you will, as he might be. Certainly Hindus would think that in particular, but still it's pretty provocative. So you have God creating this finite other out of love, right? He would say, which is the world, but the world is free vis-a-vis God. So God creates a finite reality that is free over against God, right? And that actually brings us into the world with which most of us are familiar. The antithesis, if you will, between the one God and us. Infinite, finite, eternal, temporal, ahistorical, historical, right? And what happens in the Bible throughout the Old Testament is that gets absolutized. Right, God is one, I am incomparable, there is no other, I give my glory to no one else, 2nd Isaiah, all these other gods are illusions, they're dreams, all that stuff. And so that's a necessary moment for Hegel in the development of spirit as spirit, because the finite has to be genuinely finite over against the infinite. And it has to exert its freedom over against the infinite. But the finite is the infinite in the moment of finitude. And so it's not going to be able to pull this off to its own satisfaction. And what it's going to lead to is a sense that we are radically good because we're spirit. Right? I love that about Hegel. And we're radically evil because we posit ourselves over against the infinite. And we absolutize the end. God is infinite, God is glorious, and we keep doing that. We keep pushing God up there and evacuating ourselves of God here. Worms that we are, etc. And so for Hegel, that's actually a necessary moment, because that then accentuates just how intense the moment of finitude is, that it seems like a rupture. And it's experienced existentially, he says in that bottom quote, this antithesis between us and God is evil, he says, and it's experienced as infinite anguish. There's this infinite anguish in us. And he says in the very last sentence, anguish is present only where there is opposition to what ought to be to an affirmative, right? So we realize we're in opposition to something that should be something we're affirming. And I also love the sentence right before that. Human beings are inwardly conscious that in their inmost being, they are a contradiction.
Yes.
Yeah.
They don't think contradictions. They don't make they are a contradiction. So we are a contradiction. It needs to be reconciled, right? Yeah, that's something. Pascal, by the way, is the first one to say that human beings are a contradiction, but Hegel picks up on that. So that creates this infinite anguish in us that needs reconciliation. And so he says at the top of page 2, what satisfies this need is the consciousness of atonement, of the sublation, the nullification of the antithesis, so that the latter is not the truth. So the truth can't be the infinite God over against finite human beings. The truth has to be the unity of the infinite God with finite human beings. Rather, the truth is the attainment of unity through the negation of the antithesis. So you negate the antithesis between God and humanity. This is the peace, the reconciliation that the need demands. Yep.
Is that why Jesus is so unconditionally forgiving of all of these things that we indulge in, and that we aren't perfect? We're going to fail. We're going to be evil as well as good. And it just seems like he is the one. And in the Lord's Prayer, it's the only thing that Jesus asks back from us is that we forgive others as we are forgiven.
And then he adds a little codicil at the end of that. For I tell you, if you do not forgive those who sin against you, God will not forgive you. Our prayer would be very different if every Sunday when we said the Lord's Prayer, we added that verse. You want to be forgiven by God? Forgive one another. Yeah, that would be, so for him, Jesus is primarily on this mission of reconciliation, but the reconciliation for him is attained when Jesus is dead.
And it
Right.
requires our becoming aware of ourselves through another.
Right. No, exactly. So we become aware of ourselves. We become aware that we are, when we become aware of ourselves, truly, we become aware of God. And when we become aware of God, we become aware that we are one with others, the spirit, right? The community. So the first thing that happens after Jesus dies is what? A community is formed that didn't exist before, right? So it wasn't like Jesus pegged on to a pre-existing community. This, of course, creates all sorts of problems historically with the Jewish community, but the Jews would recognize the Christian community is not just an outgrowth of Judaism. Anyone who thinks it is crazy. So for Hegel, this is the new thing, right? This community of reconciliation, which lives then very differently. And you see, Martin Luther King Jr. is onto something. The community can't stand unreconciled antitheses. So enemy, friend, that's got to go, right? Us, them, that's got to go. I, you, as an absolute antithesis, that's got to go. Northern hemisphere, southern hemisphere, that's got to go. Oppressor, oppressed, that's got to go. It's going to take a while. You know, it doesn't happen like right away, but you can't accept those as absolute. That's an illusion. That's evil. To accept unreconciled reality as absolute is evil. And friends, we are in that age. We're doing that right now.
Take a screenshot.
Take a screenshot. Okay.
Take a screenshot.
Of. I'm sorry, I don't understand what Anne's asking me.
She might not be meaning to talk to you.
Okay.
I don't know.
Oh, all right. Maybe that's true. Anyway, so that's I think the heart of the matter. But I need us to get to this one quote before I'm really in trouble and David comes in and throws a flag on the field. But he talks about, so what is the genuine other? The genuine otherness, he says in the third paragraph on the second page, the substantiality of the unity of the divine and human nature comes to consciousness for humanity. So in other words, we need to become conscious that God's spirit and our spirit are one spirit. We need to become conscious of that. But it only happens if it happens when a human being appears to consciousness as God, and God appears to it as a human being. That's Jesus, right? And so there's a singularity to this appearance that's absolutely necessary. Moreover, there's a singularity to that appearance that's absolutely necessary that happened, and that's death. He says, but this humanity in God, and here he's talking about Jesus, and indeed the most abstract form of humanity, the greatest dependence, the ultimate weakness, the utmost fragility is natural death. And then he quotes his hymn, God himself is dead. It says in a Lutheran hymn, expressing an awareness that the human, the finite, the fragile, the weak, the negative are themselves a moment of the divine. So that's God in that moment. A moment of the divine, that they are within God himself. So death is within God himself. That finitude, negativity, otherness are not outside of God and do not as otherness hinder unity with God. That's an amazing statement. Otherness, the negative, is known to be a moment of the divine nature itself. This involves the highest idea of spirit. Right. So this, and if you've heard of the Death of God movement that took place in the 60s, I think it was, that's just an aftershock of Hegel. So like 140 years late. Hegel said this a long time, and then Nietzsche will say God is dead and we killed him, right? But and Hegel would agree, but God isn't just dead, right? But that's an amazing sentence. And that's what theologians were running away from for 1800 years. They were saying it, that the Father creates the finite world is subject to death, sin and death and evil, and the Son dies, right? But no, the Son didn't die, because the Son's immutable. The human nature died, etc. So for him, the fact that the church never embraced this central claim meant that they never figured out the truth that was actually being represented by its creed and by its narratives, if you will. But then he would say, and then the next quote, toward the bottom where it says God has died, God is dead, the last sentence in that, God, that is to say, maintains himself in this process. So God isn't lost in this death. Yes, thank you. And the latter is only the death of death, right? It is out of infinite love, and there he's returning to that theme, that God has made himself identical with what is alien to himself in order to put it to death. This is the meaning of the death of Christ. And so without then moving on to the resurrection and the spirit, you don't really see. So the story doesn't end with the death, right? What's essential is that God maintains God's self through that moment of death. But that death is a moment in the life of God is a really remarkable. I mean, this is like nobody had dared to say this in such a public way as Hegel did. And it's, you can imagine it's still very controversial today. My Roman Catholic friends hate this. Right? They really do. They hate this idea because for them, God is essentially immutable and death is not a moment in the life of God. And there are Protestant theologians who by and large would agree with them. There are others, though, as we'll see, who don't think this was a mistake. They think that we actually had an opportunity here to learn something that we should have learned a long time ago, that death is a moment in the life of God, but that God doesn't avoid death, but God isn't lost in death. Right. So God returns to God's self through death, and that then is eternal life. But eternal life passes through death. It doesn't just escape it. It doesn't just avoid it. I often think Christians make a huge mistake, and I'm be one of them, that we think that our faith frees us from death. It makes us escape death. It does not. You know this, right? We all know this. And the older we get, the more we know it. And sometimes we learn it much younger than we need to. But this idea that spirit does not avoid death, but passes through death and maintains itself as spirit through death is really something. I mean, whether you like this or not, and you don't have to agree with any of the people we're looking at, but this is, you can see, this would be in Western Christianity, and actually even Eastern Christians get influenced by this. This is a watershed moment. And no one had ever said anything quite like that before. So anyway, but did you have a question?
I'm just curious, like the whole Trinity, it wouldn't be a Trinity if it wasn't the Holy Spirit, which seems to bring back the wholeness.
Right. No, exactly. Now, so that's it. When I said at the beginning that the Spirit is the key to the Trinity, Hegel shows that's why. I mean, he's one reason why. We've seen it over and over again. For Augustine, the love for God poured into our hearts by the Spirit becomes the key to the whole Trinity for him. And for Hegel, the Spirit is absolutely essential. It isn't like, oops, oh, and then there's the Spirit, and then these wacky Pentecostals, or the Methodists or whatever. The Spirit is absolutely essential. That's the goal. The goal is God as Spirit coming to God's self as Spirit through the death of Christ, right? And then the community realizing it is Spirit in the communion of the Spirit, right? And that communion then, now you have another divide. Thank you, choir members. You have the community separating itself from the world, right? The church and the world. They're not that there's a wall. It's like for Hegel, no, that's the next wall that has to come down, is the church and the world that separation has to be reconciled. Yes.
Does Spirit actually create community at Pentecost though, rather than?
Oh, yeah. No, that
immediately after the death of Christ, because there's.
Oh, no, he wouldn't say immediately. No, he would. Right. No, he's not. By immediately, he just means necessarily. He doesn't mean temporally. But necessarily, the Spirit would follow. If this is really reconciliation of infinite and finite, then the Spirit, the moment of Spirit, would necessarily follow the death. But he can demonstrate that philosophically, if you will, conceptually, which is really what's amazing. I mean, history for him can be demonstrated. And you can see then Karl Marx is going to come along shortly after this and say, yes, history can be demonstrated, but it's a materialist dialectic. It's not an intellectual dialectic. So you can see just how, I mean, we're still living in the post-Hegel world. He changed everything. Even this thing, look at this, and then I have to stop. If you have questions, Mel, we have to let people go. But listen rhetorically to what people say now. In the olden days, when somebody did something heinous and wasn't called to account, what would people say? God will judge. Yeah. You think you're escaping, God will judge. What do we say now? This was a horrible event, but...
We got to do something.
No, we got to do something, or else what will judge?
What?
History. History will judge. Where in the world did that come from? Hegel, right? So it's all immanent. So God isn't outside of history judging it. History is itself the judgment. Isn't that interesting? So that means, though, that God becomes horizontalized. God becomes historical. And I just think it's fascinating how quickly we made that transition. But listen, you'll never hear anyone say, even somebody as pious as Joe Biden will say, and history will judge Russia for invading Ukraine. And if I were Vladimir Putin, I'd say, ooh, I'm afraid. Right? Somebody 10 years from now is going to write a book saying this was a horrible event. Oh, I'm trembling in my boots. So anyway, but yeah, that's how pervasive Hegel has become, is we now don't say God will judge, we say history will judge. So anyway, well, I hope this was interesting. Thank you so much for staying.